How you
Hi,
doing? You doing all right?
good. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's good to see you. So we have been
Good to see
talking
you
about,
too.
and Clayton is here.
Clayton, hey
Philip,
Clayton.
good old Clayton, Phillip Shinn. So let's see here. But yeah, no, we were talking.
Well,
It is good to see you, sir. It is a pleasure. I hope you are doing well, Clayton. And Phillip Shinn, how you doing, Phillip Shinn? It is good to see you. It is a pleasure. It is a pleasure. So we were talking about Michelle. What have you been thinking about? So Andrew Luber on our last net was talking about. Oh, and here is Mr. Luber on disagreement, the value of disagreement in conversation. What is disagreement? There's always this nervousness of always agreeing. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. And Chetan, good old Chetan. So Mr. Luber, oh,
oh
is puppy? Oh, Mr. Luber's got like a puppy. Oh my goodness, Chetan, good to see you, sir. Oh man, that is adorable. Well, Mr. Luber, I was just asking Michelle what she's been thinking because we're interested in this topic of disagreement, the value of it in conversation. When is it bad? When is it good? There seems to be a difference between a valuable disagreement, but then there's a disagreement where I say, I disagree. And it's almost like a power move and a kind of game theory dynamic, and that doesn't seem good. But then there's the problem of the yes man, where we all agree all the time and we don't make any progress. But then there also seems to be a kind of nervous disagreement, which is let's disagree just to make sure that we're not all brainwashed by our own ideas, which doesn't seem proper because then you're disagreeing just to have a feeling of certainty that you're making progress. So it's a really interesting topic because I think the first thing I would say, and then I'll give it to Michelle, is that I feel like because we're so trained on like the 24/7 news that is always a debate structure, that you get used to conversations that are substantive having two sides and people are debating for their sides. And so then if you don't have disagreement, there's something like nerve-wracking about it. But then at the same time, if you're disagreeing with someone, then that means you have a position that you are defending. Whereas very often in these kind of conversations, it's more like people don't so much have positions as they're trying to figure out how to navigate something that they don't fully understand, or you're thinking like, for example, in a net conversation, I'm not so much I personally don't feel like I'm defending a position so much as I'm trying to think thoughts that I've never thought before, that I need people like you find people to be able to think those thoughts I've never thought before, and to try to navigate a space that I'm going back and forth on. Like I would say to start, like very often the topics we get into, I think we get into them precisely because we kind of disagree with how they're presented in the world, right? We disagree with how people talk about them or how people tend to think about them, or we disagree with our own tendency to think about those thoughts. So there is a sense where I think a lot of the conversations, there is a disagreement, but it's not so much between the people here as it is between, say, ourselves and the world, ourselves and how the world presents it, how people think about topics. So that's one thing to consider. And then I also wonder if actually a lot of debate disagreements are kind of like low resolution debates. Like it's kind of like, everyone's talking about the border right now. Close the border, open the border. Well, it's kind of like a low resolution. What I mean by low resolution, it's like, okay, we know the terms, we know what we're debating, and it's a question of policy. But if we're debating what is desire, what is beauty, it's like there's not even certainty yet on what those terms refer to before we can even start to have a debate about it, right? Like I think about like the great Deleuze-Hegel debate. No, I stay up at night on that debate, and I so badly over the years have wanted to go Deleuze is wrong, and then I'm always like, no, he's not. Dang it! And I have to keep revisiting and revisiting and revisiting. And actually, there were many times where I wanted to take a hard position against Deleuze, that it actually turned out good that I didn't take that hard position, because then I read him closer and went back and actually came to new ideas. But then there's a point where the disagreement actually becomes more refined with time, say on the theory of kind of human motivation in terms of this creative connection or fundamental lack. Like they were talking about a theory underground, which could be a higher resolution, but I think there are things to think those things through. So I do wonder if sometimes like disagreement too soon cuts off the possibility of the development of higher order disagreement that really gets at higher stakes. So those are some things, but let me give it to you, Michelle. And I like the bow in your hair. It's very pretty and it matches your outfit. So what do you think? And then I'll give it to Clayton and Mr. Luber. What do you think about this topic, Michelle?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, baby, I can make hot chocolate. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great topic and happy to see you all. Happy to be here. Yeah, it makes me think about our Ojiro's conversation, Daniel, on debate versus discussion that we had. And just the fact that I think I can understand the desire to see disagreement, because I think we often conflate disagreement with rigor. Like, oh, we're not just pandering to the ideas we all agree with. It's like something that feels more like we're being more rigorous. At the same time, though, I think the rigor is necessary, but I think it should be located more in one's own individual cultivation of ideas. So yeah, I think that we just need to think about where the rigor should be. And yes, if it's not as if you can't, it's just about what do we mean by disagreement? What do we mean by rigor? Because I think a lot of times that more sort of like combative style of disagreement, to me, I don't always find that to be like extremely productive. It can be productive, but I think assuming it's always productive and assuming it's always the most like rigorous engagement with the topic, to me is a false assumption, or it's an assumption. It's not necessarily substantiated. So yeah, I think that, but it's understandable that in the way that we're taught and how everyone for the most part is educated all their lives, it's like there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer, you know, and people assume that like that sort of tension is, you know, is actually oh, we're learning, or like, oh, this is real, or something like that. But maybe we just have a very skewed sense of what reality is, and maybe what we could maybe tap into is more of the understanding of, it's not that there actually will always be agreement and disagreement, but it's about the how, you know. So yeah, I think that it's just one last thing. People will say this too with relationships, like, oh yeah, like it's good we're fighting because like we're being real. And there's an element of like where you need that vulnerability to have you know, open discussion. But I think we fall into like, oh, we're arguing, so you know, it means we care, or something. Like, instead of being like, wait, maybe we should get better at like refining what we think and what we want to deliver as a point in that relationship, or like concern in that relationship, so that it doesn't just have to be kind of combative and kind of volatile. But we do, I think, because we don't know always how to do that, or we don't learn that, then we just assume that doing it that way, where it's very volatile and very sort of rough and abrasive, is like us doing it. Like we're doing it, you know, because we're doing it with that other person, when really, you know, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily like, oh, this is, because people will say that. Like I remember people saying that, oh, it's good if you have a fight, because then, you know, it means like not like fist fight, but you know, an argument, because it means you're really getting into the reality of like life. And that's like, it seems so, it's so close to being right. But I think what makes it not correct is where we have the abrasiveness, where do we have the tension and the friction? I do believe we should have that within ourselves as we refine certain things, so that when we have conversations, yes, there might be some big emotions, or it might be kind of difficult, it might feel challenging, but it should, I don't think that, I think it can be a place where you bring all that work, all that tension you've worked through to the table, so that hopefully you can have an actually productive conversation and make headway with that other person relationally, instead of it just being this cycle of like those fights that keep repeating, which feels like you're doing like real relationship. So anyways, those are some thoughts there, but thank you all for listening.
No, that's magnificent. And Hyde is a fantastic name for a puppy, to be short for Heidegger, Mr. Luber. That's really well done. I'll pass it to Clayton and Andrew Luber. And I think what you're saying on this idea that a lot of people...
Congratulations!
I know, it's so cute. And it's like, I think there's like, so it's very interesting. So there's the avoiding disagreement because you're scared of it. That seems bad. Like you don't want that. Then there's the, I never fight with my own tension, so I force you to deal with it. That's bad. Then there seems to be the overly explicit disagreement where I say to you, that's stupid. That doesn't seem to be working. But then there's that kind of, in storytelling, we talk about, you know, showing, not telling, where I show you my disagreement, like I line out the argument, this is why I disagree, but I don't make it explicit or make it your responsibility to prove your position to me. Like I'm trying to co-labor with you. So there's a disagreement that seems like a co-laboring. and there's a disagreement that seems to be like putting up a wall. Like, for example, like last week where Mr. Jockin was talking about quantify versus qualify on the notion of virtue not being kind of something you can quantify. I didn't disagree with that at all. By quantifying, it was the notion of the building up these things that you negate to make a clearing for virtue. But the way that Mr. Jockin went about the quote unquote disagreement was not to straight up say, that's stupid, Daniel, but to say, let me problematize that, which is it's like a disagreement that's an invitation to refinement. And this is where it seems to be a different kind of art form. And I think there's a kind of art to disagreement that actually enables the disagreement to be more like changing direction on a journey. Like we come up on a road in a journey and I'm like, we should go right. And Jockin's like, we should go left. And he's like, this is why we should go left. It's like, actually, yeah, that's a better direction. And we go, but we're actually, it's more like we're disagreeing on the direction on a journey we're on together, which seems to change the quality of the disagreement versus I stand here, you stand there, and nobody's moving at all. There's no co-laboring. There's a firing at one another, and you're dumb. So there seems to be a difference in a kind of co-laboring disagreement that is an invitation to a different direction in the navigation versus an overly explicit disagreement of positions that they're really, like when I think about Fox News or MSNBC or all these different things, like people come on these debate shows not to change their position, but to defend their position. That seems to be very, very different. Like they don't have any plan to change their mind. In fact, if they change their mind, they could like lose votes, right? So they're actually coming to defend their position, which maybe I'm not saying there's never a place for that, but it's a different attitude from let's figure out how to navigate through this issue that we believe the way it is generally accepted or thought about in the world is lacking something. So we disagree with its presentation in the world. So let's try to figure out the way to navigate through it. Oh, and one of the reasons we're talking about this is because nobody here is entirely sure of the best way to do it. So there's not really a position, but there is a shared notion that this journey is worth taking. That's almost the position. The position is we all share that this should be considered and we should go on this journey. And that seems very different. I mean, also, and then I'll give it to Clayton and Mr. Luber, it's like, also there seems to be a big difference. If the answer is always a kind of bothness or it's a kind of refinement, then it's very hard to take a hard position because you always see value in the other side. Mr. Jockin, good to see you. We're talking about the virtuous forms of disagreement, the vice forms of disagreement that Mr. Luber left us on. And I think it's very interesting, like this topic, because there seems to be an art to disagreement that invites a person into a co-laboring on a journey with you, as opposed to a disagreement that is defending a position and putting up walls. That was some of the general things we were talking about, and how very often the tensions of disagreement are work that people need to do on inside of themselves that they bring to the table, as opposed to thrust upon other people during the discussion. And different things like that we're coming to buy. But it's good to see you, Mr. Jockin. And those videos you're putting up on the events you have going on in Georgia have been fascinating. I've really enjoyed those discussions. Everyone should go to Mr. Jockin's channel. But let me pass it to Clayton, Mr. Luber, and Phillip. Clayton, how are you today, sir? It is good to see you.
I'm great, and I feel very privileged to be here. It was a struggle trying to negotiate with myself getting up this morning, but I made it. Yay. Getting to disagreement. Wow, you shared quite a few great things that have been coming up as I listened to both of you. But the thing that is coming back to me that, we've spoken about this on the net before is vulnerability is slow. And I think when we try to approach it in a fast way, this is what happens. Like you lose control and things start to, let's say, you lose touch with the reality of that experience. And that, of course, that's going to drive you to a place of conflict, because the conflict is not about you'd say the thing that is being brought forth. It's more about a defense for the loss of reality, because you feel like your reality is being challenged right now and it's being dismissed and you're about to lose it. And so that motivates you to stand up for it. It's like, no, if I have to live in that reality that is being proposed over the reality that I'm experiencing right now, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. So I have to stand up for it. I have to fight for it. And so, which reminds me of, the need for the volatility, because the volatility is sort of like, you've heard of that phrase, probably, I think it's Jordan Peterson makes it really popular, about pain being the most real thing. So hence, it's like, we know that it's like when you go to the pains, that's where the most reality is. So if you're trying to amplify reality, you're definitely going to go that route. But then it comes at a cost, right? It's like if you get combative, then it sort of like just falls into a fight, which is then an unhealthy disagreement. But we need something more healthy. And so another thing that comes up then is what Viveki keeps going on about, the difference, is it philia Nicaea and versus philosophia, trying to keep those in balance. It's trying not to be combative, instead try to integrate, try to understand the reality on offer, and integrate it with your own reality so that we can see how to go forth. What you're just saying, Daniel, which takes me back to the apophatic, right? It's kind of like we're both trying to explore these apophatic experiences, and we're touching edges, and now we're in disagreement of what the edge is. And we could fight about that, or we could help each other. You've had that example of the people who have been blindfolded and asked to touch an elephant, and everybody reports back differently. But they could have collaborated about this. It's like, okay, so if your hand is next to mine and we're feeling different things, but at which point do they connect, right? And I think that is what we try to do here on the net, sort of take the difference and make a one pot meal with this difference and see what it tastes like. And I think as we experience that, as we join in and put all our thoughts together in this one pot, something beautiful bubbles up and we all taste it, and it's all new to all of us. It's definitely not what we put in, but something great came out at the end. And I guess that's why we keep coming back, right? Thanks. I'll stop there. I'll pass it back to you.
I really like that idea of the co-laboring to figure out the apathetic. That's very nice. And the kind of slowness on the vulnerability, that seems really, really important. I'll pass it to Luba, Phillip, and Chetan, and a few things come to mind. I know you also said in our recent talk tomorrow that comes out tomorrow, on the idea that a lot of times we respond to words, not what people mean. I feel like most disagreement is a disagreement of words, not what people mean. And you can destroy you can destroy a conversation real fast by doing that, and it's not productive. Because there's this question of, I think we all know that there's a form of disagreement that is not productive per se. It doesn't help with anything. But then we all know that if you turn on to, say, a news station and everyone agrees with one another, that doesn't seem good either, right? So there's a ditch on either side of the road. There's like, you never disagree, or you always agree, and that doesn't work. So there's some sort of, dare I say, middle here. Because there's also something about, like in a marriage, if you never disagree or you never have tension, there is some sort of jewel of reality that can be gained from a fight or a disagreement that is really powerful. But then here's the trick. You have to have the skill to mine and hold that disagreement and have it change the quality of your interaction when you're not fighting, right? So this is the issue. Like what can happen is if you overemphasize reality in the fight, well, then basically you have to always be fighting to have reality. Well, that doesn't seem good. So there's some sort of skill that is needed to kind of pull out the gold of the disagreement that is different from disagreeing, that then has the disagreement be constructive. This is what's interesting. There is some skill of where you look at a debate, you find the gold, and then you're able to mine it out of the disagreement and still have that gold without there being a continual disagreement, if you will. You don't need that tension. That's what seems very interesting. I mean, another thing that could happen, I could right now just kind of say, why are we even talking about the apathetic? We've got, poverty is really bad, the border crisis, the economy's bad. Why are we all just standing around talking about philosophical ideas, right? That's it. We're done. I've been disagreeable in a manner that destroyed everything, right? And for what, mind you? Are we able to do anything about trade agreements, the border, or anything? No. But, a lot of times these net conversations, another thing I would say is these kind of philo circling whatever, and I'll pass it to Luber Phillip, is in Chetan, is that one of the reasons why I think you don't have as much quote unquote visual disagreement, because I would actually say there's actually plenty of disagreement in terms of problematization, saying that's not the best wording, and refining of navigation is what I would say. What you see in these conversations is a lot of refining of the direction that the conversation is unfolding versus a defending of position, because a defending of position is very stagnant, whereas a refining of direction is moving to kind of figure out how to think about something. A lot of that you're doing because you're actually trying to figure out how to make better decisions in your life or how to better interpret things. You're not trying to say defend capitalism or defend the Democrats or whatever. You're trying to think about these matters that is going to have a real impact in the way that you engage with other peoples and you make your own decisions, because it is not so clear how you should go about doing that or how you should think about your own motivation or how you should relate to different people. That kind of effort is not what defines the majority of political debates, news, whatever that you see. The high majority of discourse that makes up the kind of the world, if you will, is not like that. That's why the quality of that kind of discourse, I think, tends to be more basically trying to shut down the other person for a kind of victory. There's more to be said, but those kind of things come to light. So this notion of co-laboring and disagreement being the refinement of the direction, or disagreement on the direction. But here's the thing. If you disagree with me and you help me navigate a better direction, I'm grateful for you. That's also a big difference that hides, that I want to say conceals the disagreements when they emerge in these conversations. Because if it's on the news and you disagree with me and prove me wrong, I've just lost my voters. I just lost tenure. I lost something in the disagreement. But in a conversation like this, if you prove me wrong, you save me from going in a bad direction in my life choices. So then there's a gratitude that results from the disagreement, which then the thing is, most of the time we confirm the presence of disagreement by a kind of upsetness or anger or brr. But in these kind of conversations, if you refine people's direction, then there's actually, and I'm convinced of it, then there's a gratitude that comes from that. And so there's a different kind of coloring, I think, to disagreement and being a changing of navigation. More needs to be said, but let me pass it to Luber, Phillip, and then Chetan. Mr. Luber, your puppy is cute. I hope it runs up and licks your face.
Well, thank you for saying that Hyde's cute. He's great. Great puppy. Smart, like Heidegger, knock on wood. Hopefully that, remains. He really doesn't make that many accidents. He sleeps through the night. But anyway, I mean, so much was said. Where to start? Okay, so I totally agree with the words versus the meaning of words distinction. It made me think of a very famous Michael Scott from The Office quote where he goes like, you don't call someone retarded, you call your friends retarded. And like that just to me encompasses the whole distinction between words, meaning, because how the word is used in the context, the motivation behind using the word is really the kernel, is really the point of why you're even there talking. So people get caught up in the words and forget the whole reason why you're even in the position and uttering anything in the first place. That's a quick sidebar. Why I like Lacan so much, it's like he focuses on the enunciation. He's immediately thinking about the motivational, not really thinking about the behavioral in a story sense. What's motivating the character's behavior is what matters, not necessarily the behavior, because the behavior can be interchangeable. The behavior there's so many different behaviors that can manifest depending on how you approach the motivation. It could be the same motivation and there could be 10 different behaviors representing that motivation. But so, okay. I think what you were saying about the journey and making a decision to go left or right is like so important. So like I make a lot of stories and I always work in a group setting. And I like to think that I've created an atmosphere, a culture of fighting, of disagreement. Um, in the sense that we're all part of the same fight. So another crude way to put it is like when I'm writing with my friends and like I'm writing, I'm making a short right now. Stop. I'm sorry if I say certain things, it's because of the puppy. But basically, um if I am writing with my friends, I could just be like "fuck you," and no one blinks an eye. They might smile and laugh because there is no real animosity. Like there is difference. I am coming from a different position. I have my own information pool that I'm coming from, and I might not agree with you. And I could be like, fuck you, bro. And they are okay with it because the information pool that I'm coming from, it doesn't really matter. It's about, it's more about just looking at my notes, it's more about the information pool, what it's striving toward. It's beyond my actual position. Like we are okay with saying basically anything to each other because the whole point isn't what I'm saying. It's trying to arrive at something beyond my own position. And the only way to get there is the other. And not just having someone else say yes or no, but just getting there in the sense of like trying to make the window clearer, using like almost like a windshield analogy. Like you need to wipe it back and forth. And in my mind, in order to go back and forth, you either have to be a brilliant individual or you need a community. You need a whole community in order to sway back and forth, in order to see what's beyond in a clear way and achieve that beyond in a clear way. Another thing, I mean, this is where, I mean, I've been reading so much Lacan lately, and it's like, I'm like thinking, what's the difference between the drive and theme? And it's because they're so similar, but a very important difference, it's a framing problem. The theme is absolutely pivotal to a story, where I think philosophy really needs the drive. It really does need the drive in order to really make sense of a lot of philosophical inquiries. However, the drive isn't present in a lot of philosophical inquiries. There seems to be an approach where it's like, I don't need to take psychoanalysis and I don't need to hold it in order to do philosophy. So how you frame the problem allows you to see where the problem itself intersects with other domains. So to come up with, I know we've had a net discussion on like, when is it okay to make a new term? Well, it's okay to make a new term when there's a disagreement about a lack of intersection, when you find there to be a need for an intersection. So to me, just coming up with new terms, literally you need disagreement to come up with new terms. You need to see where there's a lack of intersection. Like I think lack itself needs disagreement. So the question to me is, how do you have a shared argument and yet maintain difference? Maintaining the difference and yet having a shared argument, because all these problems that we're facing in the world, it's because everybody wants to maintain difference and not really acknowledge the shared argument. And the second you say, oh, we're sharing the same problem and we're trying to get to an actual solution, it seems like people start, like the concept of difference just dissipates in the situation here. And it's very ipso facto. And the way around that is by framing the problem in a way where you have to be different in order to have a shared argument, subsuming the difference and the sharedness. And if you're not creating the problem space in a way in which you are subsuming the difference and the sharedness, then you're just going to come to this binary situation where it's like we're either in a shared situation or not, and that's the problem. And then one more thing. I mean, for me, like, and like they say this about the drive as well, but like theme is the tension itself. It's the tension of the shared difference that allows you to see beyond your own position. So like when you're making a journey, when you're writing like a journey, you don't really necessarily know where it's going. You have an idea, you have the sentiment of where it's ending in the back of your mind, but you need to talk it out. You need to mend the sword. You need to be able to have that friction in order to know whether to go left or right. And there is no other way besides having, it's like, oh, we're part of the same journey, but there's different ways in which the sentiment at the end of the journey can be achieved. And the only way to ever really pick a tangible path is to go back and forth in the different possibilities in manifesting the sentiment that's required. So that, to me, that back and forthness is the theme that literally generates the possibilities of choosing the particular path of arriving to the sentiment that's required. And okay, sorry, one more thing, and then I'll pass it off. But like, a good way to do that is by not looking, like, to go back to the words versus the meaning. If you're looking at the meaning, you're looking at the whole of the argument. And if you're looking at the whole of the argument, that means you're not looking necessarily at the argument itself. You're looking at something that's basically causal to the argument. You're looking at something that's like, I almost want to say a new word. It's not an argument. It's something that's needed for an argument, but what this thing that I'm talking about is, it needs the argument, it needs the tension in order to even achieve this this goal of shared difference. And ironically, it's also the very same conditions that allow people to even enter in the argument space. So just like Hegel, you find yourself back from where you start. And like that is the only way. Like when people are talking on Fox News and CNN, they're not, stop fighting. And basically when they're talking, they're not looking at the whole argument. They might be saying, oh, I'm looking at both sides, and when I take your side into consideration, it's just absolutely wrong. The whole thing, if you're looking at the whole argument, both sides are automatically wrong. Like, you have to be, the other has to be a little right in order to even be participating in the argument. Even if something seems completely obscure or completely wrong, there's something that's making you be in the position to engage and utter something. And you have to focus on that particular glimpse, that moment where it's like, wait a second, this person's saying 2 + 2 = 5. I got to tell them how it's 4. What is making you want to tell this person that it's 4? That's the focus. That's what matters, not the 4 or 5 or the equation at all. It's what's putting you in that position in the first place. Geez, I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to pass it off. And yeah, great conversation. Fuck you guys. Just kidding. Love you.
Well, we feel like friends then. Oh, that's so beautiful. That's good. I really appreciate it. You said a lot. I'll pass it to Phillip and Chetan. I think it's very clear that there's a massive difference between a disagreement for the sake of a shared context and a refinement of that shared context, and a disagreement that is stay away from my context, stay away from my meaning. Like, there's disagreement that treats the other as kind of a contamination, and there's disagreement that is extremely good, which is the disagreement to figure out how to make better the story. And maybe the problem is the word disagreement is used to do too much. It is used to define the difference between liberal and conservative, and to define the debate that goes on in the writing room for the story. It's all called disagreement, but it seems to have very different quality about the character of that disagreement. And it seems like also disagreement for story. Like, disagreements on the net are for the sake of the shared context of being a human being that finds himself in finitude, having to make decisions when it is not obvious what the best decision is, and reality consists of trade-offs, problem management versus problems and solutions, and we're also trying to figure out the best shared context by which to live our life. And these are all things that are not self-evident, But there are right and wrong answers, right? There are better and worse answers, but figuring that out requires the friction so that you begin working in that direction. So I think that kind of disagreement as refinement is important. And it's just like, well, Mr. Jacob talks about beauty, right? Like if there's a shared context of beauty, then it's possible to have philosophy be trying to refine something through disagreement toward that beauty. But if you lose in philosophy things like truth, goodness, and beauty, or shared context, then it becomes very difficult to have a function of disagreement that isn't just putting up walls. You could say disagreement when people believe in truth is different from disagreement where people don't believe in truth, or pure relativism, right? Now, depends on what you mean by truth, but if you grant me that, a shared story. I'll pass it to Philip. The last thing I'll say is that I think basically disagreement, I love you, Luba, take your time, sir. Yes, sir, take your time. I think disagreement plus story is dialectic in Hegel. Like dialectic is the going back and forth and sublating. The sublation is the shared context. And the problem is that we have not realized that we have a responsibility in disagreement to artfully disagree in such a way that keeps a focus on the shared context and makes possible a sublation. And as a result, disagreement has not had the proper function, because it seems like you have to do this, create tension for the sake of the achievement or refinement or movement toward the shared context, but not such in a way that you lose sight of the shared context. Well, now we're talking about an art form of some kind that may align with what Hegel means by dialectic, because dialectic has to include that sublative moment. Let me pass it to Philip and then Chetan. And I know Chetan's up at 4 a.m. because he's a hero for the people. You're a hero for the people. And Clayton's up at like freaking 5 a.m. I know. Right there, Chetan. Philip, please, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. I feel like super lazy. It's like 1:30 here. Everything's just gravy. Yeah, I think we have to distinguish between verbal and nonverbal disagreements. And I think it's fine to say we don't know really how to disagree verbally. We're not very good at that as a species. We're pretty good at like just ending other people's lives if we don't like them. And I think you can take something what Chetan was talking about with the subject of psychosis book. They don't sometimes see any point in language. Why talk? Shoot, man, I got 7 or 8 messages because I'm from Kansas City about parade yesterday. You know, just like people that are there, right? And supposedly, like, not all mass shootings are pre-planned. Some happen through people disagreeing, right? So you might say we talk because we have a certain level of physical excitation that seeks release. Okay, this can take a million different forms. We've created one technology we call language. People are actively trying to destroy that because it's sort of a flimsy technology. Like the track record is hit or miss. But what else do we have? And I think so much of, you know, it involves like agreeing to disagree. This might be what like the mutually assured destruction ultimately is. It's like we're gonna agree to not end life yet for humans. And how do you get people to agree to disagree with language when there is always the ability to just shut down the game with something more physically forceful than language? And then I think you can start kind of on, you know, you can't spell collaborate without co-labor, right? It's like, okay, that means sort of like working together. All right, so why would you do that? Why would anyone do that? And you know, you get to like very interesting culture building, different ways of like channeling aggression. I'm reminded a little bit of Kristeva's book, Black Sun and Melancholia, where she talks about like as a way of not giving in to all the crushing feelings of depression that comes from, you know, your discontents with the culture, you know, are kind of like aggressive in creating story, in writing a poem, in some kind of artistic outlet. And like, when might it be a good time to stop a verbal disagreement and move into something else. If there are people who you'll allow the fuzzy set of an enemy to life, if you will. And I also think too, like, it comes down to timing. Like, timing is very important. Like, sometimes, like, I do this a lot where I'll just like talk about random philosophical shit with my girlfriend, and she'll just be like, "What are you talking about, dude?" And this space actually helps me be less annoying, I feel, in like other spaces, because like people will say like something that like 95% of people are just like, "Oh yeah, that's probably," and it's like, but let me like get real neurotic and like, unpack this and point out all these things out. I come from a family of lawyers. Maybe it's that. And like just knowing that some people don't like confrontation. Some people, there's a certain capacity, and to I think remain patient with them, and to also know on some level it's an intersubjective activity, where if you'll just like table the big T truth for a minute, that you guys are making active and temporary like signposts of like, oh, where are we? Where are we going? We don't really know. And I agree with what everyone's really been saying, that the direction that you're going in takes a lot of emotional agility. Because if someone says something that challenges one of your models of the world, eventually you become more like tolerant and comprehensive, but that can take time to build those muscles.
I have this image of like Philip's at a fast food place, and he's like, "Hey, so Hegel and the philosophy of right," and the person at the cash is like, "What are you talking?" He's like, "Hold on," picks up the call, gets on the net. "Okay, I'd like a large fry and a hamburger," because yes. But that is funny to think that there's some sort of ventilation. And I very strongly agree with that, which actually, because you're able to get your own mind more together and less crazy, you're able to go out into civilization and not be black sheep. So I think there's truth to that. And there's something about discussion as having that function. I think you've also, I really like, hey, collaborate has co-labor in it. That's nice, Philip. I'll give it to Cheetah. I think there is something also to be said on, we have to be careful to treat speaking as if it is inherently virtuous, because it is not. Sometimes people speak to avoid action, but then we also have to be careful to act as if speaking is not necessary, because it would seem to be the case. Like, I can just speak personally. There are some topics and issues that are so complex and difficult that unless you have a bunch of people coming from a bunch of different perspectives, you can't think about them in a manner to, one, help you make decisions about them, to two, get your own mind clear on them, that could lead to various anxieties that are not productive. And the more globalized and pluralistic the world is, the higher the likelihood that your life consists of those kind of issues that, if you're not able to get a grasp on, could have various consequences on you. So there's something about the ability to have access to these kind of conversations if you're the kind of person that finds yourself struggling with those sorts of things, which then you could also argue, just by looking around the world, all the people falling into conspiracies, great governmental movements, mass movement, these different things, all of these suggest that lots of people are dealing with something like that. So then the question is, what is is philosophy about a kind of I want to say therapy, but that can be a dirty word if we're not careful. A kind of working through, getting a grasp on, to help us navigate the story that is the world. In the shared world, the shared context is this kind of globalized world that we have to figure out how to work through and make decisions in. That has to be elaborated on, but let me give it to Mr. Chetan. Mr. Chetan, it is good to see you.
Same here. I don't have a class tomorrow morning, so I just thought I'll be up. Yeah, I might just go to sleep early, so you congratulated me way too soon. Yeah, it's a really fun topic. I think we've all been discussing, and a lot of, I think, great things being said. I remember in linguistics, a long time back, I was trying to write my thesis in linguistics, and there's this idea in linguistics called subject-verb agreement. An agreement in that sense, you studied grammar in early days. So you have this simple things like Chetan's book, the apostrophe S becomes the agreement with, and so on and so forth. And that's positive actually. Basically, in English or any language, the forms of agreement are actually forms of doubling in that sense. You have some information that doubles when agreement happens. That's the underlying concept. And I remember, I think Barbier, one of the people in Europe somewhere who's doing the research upon that how information gets doubled in language in that sense. And this doubling actually happens when different portions of language, conceptual portions of language, sort of tend to agree with each other in that sense. What I want to sort of emphasize upon here is that there is something about this question of doubling, this question of splitting and doubling that is at the heart of this problem of agreement and disagreement in some senses. Which is why I don't think there can be any permanent ways of good and bad agreement or disagreement. I think there are ways in which worse forms of disagreement can be good for us, and there are ways in which best forms of agreement or disagreement can be very bad in that sense. And I often wonder what forms of agreement actually exist behind in the background for disagreement to take shape, and what forms of disagreement actually have to lurk in the background for agreement to, in that sense, emerge in certain contexts. They never emerge in isolation in my experience of things. We tend to agree when certain points intersect with large gaps behind in that sense, and a lot of times when you cut the surface underneath, you find those splits emerging immediately, and a lot of times when you disagree very violently, you just split it out a little bit and you found large forms of agreement. For instance, the most fundamentalist disagreements, if you look around you, actually involve large forms of agreement upon their own positions. They are much more similar that they would want to agree upon. When any religious fundamental disagreement you can think about. And finally, I think the question emerges: who is the one who's agreeing or disagreeing in that sense? And I often wonder when I'm sort of entering into discussions or debates, especially in reading groups, and I'm hearing somebody talk, and suddenly by instinct I'll start talking like this: I agree, but. The classic academic. and when you're saying it, it's almost a ritual. You do it. I agree, but I agree with you. It's almost a way to resolve tension in these spaces. We all do it in some ways. I do it more often than not. But I wonder who is the one who's agreeing, or who is that Chetan who's disagreeing? And I think that any form of agreement or disagreement actually doubles or splits the subject within us also. It's never a static subject, which can agreement or disagreement is actually a cut in some senses in the ebbs and flows of subjectivity, which we don't actually think too often about. In that sense, and if we, I think, reflect upon a little, we will see ourselves splitting at those moments. We may join us back together, but we will split. So in that sense, agreement or disagreement are never permanent categories that can be diverse from each other, definitely, but they are the categories that create our political world. Politics is not possible without this kind of political community. Cannot be formed without forms of disagreement and disagreement shaping them. And that's something we need to think about. What is it about politics that holds this problem? I think I'll sort of maybe end this sort of sad reflection on this question of that there are certain things to which we can have a common measure. For instance, meter length, we can find 1 meter kept in France somewhere, through which every other thing can be measured. But then there are things that which are measured, but they don't have a common measure. They can only be measured from within the context in which the measurement is taking place. We cannot have a common measure of them. Is agreement or disagreement something which takes shape, which develops its own texture when there is an absence of any external measurement possible? Is there something to that question, that when we have to agree or disagree in a context where there's no external yardstick upon which that disagreement can be judged? Does something about that disagreement changes its nature? Does something else emerge? Most of the time we have external yardsticks. Most of the time if you'll ask Chetan or I'll ask you, Daniel, why are you saying this? You'll tell me Hegel said it, this person said it, and we'll have some external yardstick and we'll both will have a, nice. But is there a point at this discussion where we'll sort of play it out where we will not have an external yardstick to go to, where we would have to settle our agreements or disagreements without that common measure? And what is at stake when that happens? And what is at stake for politics? What is at stake for difference? I'm not sure. I'm just sort of raising it as a question. Yeah.
That's brilliant, Chetan. And I think we've all had that experience now where you're talking with someone and you're saying, yes, I agree. And you're like, crap, I'm about to say but. Dang it. Because you're like, no. And Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you. We're discussing good forms of disagreement, bad forms of disagreement, the character of disagreement, et cetera, so forth. I'll give it to Mr. Jochen and Mr. Luber. I think what's interesting on this notion of kind of the ebbs and flows. So it seems like often in conversation, you're trying to figure out how to navigate the ebbs and flows, which seems to be a different quality of discussion versus defending a position, navigation versus defending. And I think what you were saying just there about how often in these kind of conversations, the measurement almost has to arise within it that then kind of retrospectively is the standard by which the conversation is judged. Because there has to be reaching the agreement of the meaning of the terms or what we're talking about to determine if what we said is internally consistent relative to that measure or succeeds at its aims relative to the measure that arose in the discussion, which is of course strange. But then at the same time, if that measure is completely arbitrary or something that the people here just made up, who cares? It has to be a measure that in its emergence convinces you has some relevance to the world that you live in or the life that you are in. And that's also part of, I think, one of the reasons people can go into philosophy is because they actually can feel like the metrics that the society provides them with by which to judge life are inadequate for some reason, or there's something missing from those measures or that tract or that story, you could say. Maybe you feel like the story doesn't have a theme, so you're here looking for that theme, right? Mr. Luber? Yep. So you're looking for that theme, and the theme has to arise and then show you what is the kind of engagement that makes it possible for a theme to so arise and unfold with the story, that then if you know those skills, you might be able to bring it to the rest of your life. So if you learn the ability to create measures that are not just totally arbitrary in action by which you can then judge the actions of which arose to it, which is all weird and fun, but learning how to do that is then some sort of skill and meta skill that you could carry on. I think also on that idea of agreement and disagreement and how all disagreement has some agreement in it and vice versa is really, really good. Because otherwise it's like the similarity difference problem. If there was literally no similarity between difference at all, they couldn't make any sense of one another. There'd be no intelligibility, right? So all difference entails enough similarity by which the difference can be recognized as difference. So it goes with disagreement and agreement. And that I think is important, because then you must realize that if you're disagreeing with someone, and I think Mr. Luber was getting at this earlier as well, that there's enough of something shared that it's possible for something to be refined or something to be navigated for, or for intelligibility to be possible. Therefore, the question is simply how to go about participating in that well. Or what does that look like? That needs to be elaborated on, but I like what you were saying. Let me give it to Mr. Jock and Mr. Luber and then Phillip. But yeah, the comma but thing, it ruins everything. So it was, I laughed very hard when you said that. So Mr. Jochen, how are you today, sir?
Good to see everybody. I have lots of riffing to make. So, you know what's funny? Phil brought up that idea of like mutually assured destruction. I wrote on my notes. You know what we actually have? I think we mutually assured indifference. That's what we actually have. Because I brings up what Chetan's bringing up, and what you just said, Daniel. A lot of times we basically come to the decision or the point starting up that actually our disagreements make no difference. It just kind of passes through the vapor. Actually, a good point on this, like for example, right? Basically, I mean, one of my favorite points is disagreements over ice cream flavors, right? Like what's at stake here? What's actually in play? That's very different. That's not really even a ground of deliberation, right? Because that's usually when we see about a virtue of disagreement. That's almost always, in Aristotelian accounts, is always related to deliberation. either for finding truth or for an action, one or the other. And something like an ice cream flavor ain't going to cut it. Like there's nothing really at stake there. But that does, and then it does relate to then what is the common measure, right? That's kind of the crux of the point. And I think this idea of, what Chetan's saying about foreground and background, I think that's absolutely true. Because I don't know about anybody else, but I've been in enough debates, other contexts like that. Those containers are very different from this kind of container, completely different. Watching a court trial, like all these modes of discourse, their contexts are completely different. Their containers are completely different things that have completely qualitatively different results. I would probably say, and kind of like drawing out what is maybe one of the differences here of the kind of containers we're talking about, is when the demarcations are already preset. Like basically everything's already preset. There's a position 1, position 2, and this is really just a battle over, at best, intermediate compromise, at best. Or a lot of times, a lot of these debates are not even for the participants in the room. It's for the audience to be persuaded. So once right there, we just saw another it's put into like a third mode context. It's a meta context for the discourse. It's not even about the discourse itself. That happens a lot. I think that happens a lot in communication. Because really the kind of containers that would be this kind of, instead of this kind of either complete indifference, because actually it doesn't really matter what any position, any interlocutor has a position, has no effect, because it's just about the audience being persuaded by it, or there's just a battleground of argumentation for a decision to be made. And I think what Chetan said about a kind of cut, the decision comes from the act of cutting. They're cutting up possibilities. So I think that's actually a very important point that is sometimes what it comes down to. A decision has to be made, and it requires a cutting off. So it's not even like necessarily all these kind of containers of discourse are wrong, but there's also other kinds of containers, improv, the net, any kind of moment where you come in not prescribed what the discourse will be. And it's only in the act of doing it together that something new shows up. I definitely had this. There's been plenty of times where like there's been this conversation in this room that I'm like, oh, I got to think about that after. And I'm kind of sitting on it and thinking about it. That was not prescribed. There's a kind of room to be played here. But of course, like I said, we're kind of a privileged group that we have the capacity to participate and function in this and to get benefit from it. That's not usually the case. I think there was one note, by the way, and cares about what a kind of measure, though, another meditation on that measure of in communication. Daniel, I remember your series recently on forgiveness, and particularly that notes that really the ultimate question about forgiveness is the willingness to reestablish a relationship. Very fascinating, because it is true. One of the lines of demarcation between what Phillip said, why talk? And it's definitely been there where there's disagreements. One of the ultimate questions you have to ask is it worth continuing the conversation? And ultimately, it's really a question of, is this relationship worthy to move forward with, or willing to move forward to proceed with? And especially if there's been a rupture of some kind. So the act of forgiveness is the act of a willingness to restore the relationship. I think that's actually a really very fascinating point, because that is, it's obviously meta of the content of the container, but it's actually the measure requirement for the container even exists in the first place. So it's actually kind of an interesting point of Chetan's question about what's basically this absent measure that's independent of a common measure, or whatever that be. And also, and I'll just close on the last note, because I'm thinking of David Boehm's model of dialogue and how it works. I do think, and it's kind of I've been sitting on for a while. This relationship of what Aristotle says is quick wit. I've said this before, I'll say it again. It gets used as both that sociability, that willingness to be able to be sociable, a pleasant and sociable experience. You're not boring, nor are you just a goofball. You're actually kind of like on point in a certain social context. It's also used in the posterior analytic about quick referencing of the middle term of an inference spontaneously. It's inherently a social property going on, and it's something about some real insight. So I just I find that's a very fascinating discussion about a kind of generative container of discourse. So because basically it comes down to conflict at the end, right? And it's been noted a couple of members in this group right now. Generally, you gotta be willing to have some conflict, some tension to get to some truth here, to get to something powerful. Even, I mean, in music and in just in aesthetics, there needs to be sometimes discording colors or notes or motions or movements to draw out the whole composition. So these are kind of all just different ways of talking about how we can have this. It's basically creating communication in a relationship, right? Sometimes for intentional action, which requires deliberation and a decision to be made. So it has a kind of concreteness needs to be done, but it also can be one of generation too. It's possible as well. Yeah, I'll close with that.
Outstanding. And I appreciate that thought on the notion that forgiveness is the possibility of the container. Exactly right. I'll give it to Luber, Phillip, and then Chetan a few things. And I really never liked debate in the sense of, and one of the reasons is because these people would get up and they would debate, pro-life, pro-choice, gay marriage, whatever. And it was for the audience. But you see, none of those people were actually going to write any laws that were going to affect these things. So it had no bearing on the choices that people made. Also, the problem with the debate format is they denied tragedy in the sense of a trade-off of competing goods. Like that was always kind of put under the rug. When really in life, so much of life is tragedy, trade-offs of competing goods. And really what you need to think about is not how am I going to defend my pro-life position, but how am I going to make choices in life, navigate trade-off, and to relate to other people. And I'm not saying debate as a format could never contribute to that, but my experience, unless we're talking like some of those IQ squared debates, which tend to be a little kind of upper there and a little more impressive, but even them, there is something about the debate format that, in my experience, can kind of deny tragedy and does not leave people with mechanisms and heuristics for choice making on things that they actually participate in and that actually matter for their lives. Now, again, if they run for office, then by all means, once you're in office and you're making laws, listen to people in discussions about pro-life, pro-choice, whatever. But actually, here's the thing. I find that often debates are a really bad way to inform those kind of issues like border security or national security. You should be reading books. You should be having extensive long-term conversations going through trade-offs. I've not found these kind of arbitrary, every side has 10 minutes to talk, preset conditions are good for problem solving. They're more like entertainment. Now, again, I don't want to say that every debate that has happened in history doesn't have any value whatsoever, but unless we're talking freaking Lincoln and Douglas debates that go on for 4 hours, a lot of these formats don't seem to be the kind that can lead to choice making. Now, again, I'm generalizing. The other thing on the quick wit I've been thinking a lot about, I think it's a fascinating topic that you've been focusing on, Mr. Jockin. What comes to mind is there's something about wit and navigation that go together, where the ability to navigate a situation quickly, it's almost like virtue as a capacity to navigate toward the beautiful or the good, right? There's a kind of ability to navigate a situation. And if there's something about these conversations that is more about navigating an ebb and flow to a non-preset ability, then that is very different than defending a position and may have some sort of training of wit if something about wit has to deal with a navigation before a path passes. It just makes me think like in wit, it's the ability of, I should go this direction in the conversation. I should diffuse the tension. I should be able to, there's some sort of, there's an opportunity passing, get it. And you have the skills to get it before it goes away. It's like high-speed navigation in a way, right? And that also has something to do with these kind of conversations, because like you say, there's no preset idea. We have no idea what people are going to say and what's going to happen. One of the reasons you're even doing this is precisely because difference will be brought to the table. Like that's come to mind, right? You wouldn't be here if everyone was going to say the same things. So there has to be the difference, but that is what makes possible the capacity of thinking thoughts that you've never thought before, of which then afterwards you can process. But to be able to participate in that requires some sort of high-speed wit, high-speed navigation to see, yes, to think of a thought, to jump in, to move like that, which if for Aristotle, wit has some sort of prime role in virtue, like some real big virtuous role, then the training of that skill seems to be quite a big deal and has something to do with navigating toward I emphasize beauty. I love beauty. There's some emphasis, as we know, there's some sort of emphasis on the navigation toward the beautiful in that. And there's something beautiful about the ability to so navigate as such. So I'm wondering if like the wit, navigation, those kind of things go together. And let me pass it to, I was also going to say, I personally also find like when I vividly disagree with a position, I tend to do it in writing, in books. And the reason is because I need to cite all of the documents, and it's like 20 pages and I have to go back to the text. Like I personally often find like that really hard disagreement is not really appropriate for conversation, because you need to like go to the book, get the citation and different things, right? Whereas in a conversation, when there's disagreement, it has more of that navigational quality versus the defending of a hard position. So that was something I was thinking as well, real quickly. Like if I'm debating the difference between value form and label form and communism, like been talking about with Dave and them, I need to have the text. I need the citations, because if I'm telling you that Marx makes, he always talks about labor as quantifying value, then that would seem like I need to be able to cite that to make the case, right? So there's something I think about writing that tends to lend itself in the direction of that character of disagreement, because it's also quite clear we don't want to say disagreement is bad. It depends on the kind of disagreement, in what context, for what purpose, et cetera, so forth. I'm happy to elaborate on that, but that was something that came to mind. Let me give it to Mr. Luber, Phillip Shinn, and then Chetan. Mr. Luber.
At this moment, I won't be shocked if I get a work call right when I'm up. That will typically happen, and screw me. I'm currently having internal conflict disagreement with how I should treat Hyde. Should I spoil the shit out of him, or should I really give him structure and ignore the whines at times? And yeah, I don't know. Funny how you can even have that with yourself. So I want to say a few things. I want to first say that there is no difference when you're thinking about the fact that everyone is in the situation, that they're occupying a spot, and that there's something that brought them initially to occupying that spot. I want to say there's a difference between what causes you to be in that spot and what is causing you to stay in that spot. And I think this is a very crucial distinction that, for me at least, that I want to make, where most people are so stubborn in what's causing them to maintain being in that spot, and they're not open to changing why they are continuing to participate in the discussion, argument, whatever. However, what remains the same no matter what is what initially caused you to be in that spot. That is unchanged. And this is where I want to talk about motivation. Motivation can be understood in both senses. What motivated you to be in that initial spot versus what's motivating you to continually be in the relation are very different. And what needs to be flexible is what's motivating you to continue. What's actually not flexible at all is that initial, the prior motivation. What motivated you to be in that spot, because there's no control over it. You're there. It happened. There's things that went into it before you even were in that spot that are irrelevant to you participating in that spot. I mean, they're relevant in the sense that it is related to everything that's going on while you are continually being in that spot. So that initial motivation actually spreads its fingers through all possible changes of why you're in that spot. And that's what's very unique. And this is where, for me, the difference between theme and depth drive or drive is. To me, and this is a very raw thought, so please, again, feel free to just absolutely fuck it, But for me, theme is that initial, what's motivating you to be in that initial spot, where the drive is you realizing while you're continuing to be in the relation, while you're continuing to choose to be in the spot. So one is retroactive. Drive is always retroactive, where when you create stories or when you're creating, it's never retroactive. Like, the end of the creation can be perceived as retroactive, that the theme was always already there. But the reality is what made there even be a there, that initial spot, that initial motivation is the theme. So that to me is the big difference between drive and theme. They both are they both have to do with the split. They both have to do with that divergence that, because I'm reading What Is Sex. I keep rereading the end because she just talks about Deleuze and Lacan in such a really good way that it's just like, I just keep finding myself going back to that like last, couple pages, like last like 20 or so pages. And like, it just made me really think about what is the difference between drive and theme. And that to me, what I just said is the difference. With that said, the preset condition isn't the 10 minutes. That's the whole, what's keeping you in the relation. But the focus should be, and I'm talking about, I forget who said, maybe it was either Daniel or Jock, and was talking about this preset and using like the 10 minutes as an example of how that's just bullshit. Because it is bullshit in the bad sense. And like, what matters is you acting in accordance to the preset in which you are in the spot. What caused you to be in that spot? All things that are continually allowing you to participate in that spot should all have to relate to why you're initially there in the first place. And like, what will happen is you'll change. That's literally what will happen. You'll be like, okay, well, I was here because of this theme. And now I'm thinking about why I'm continuing to participate. And now the drive, I think the drive is useful there. And now the drive is, I'm thinking about what is driving me, what's continually to drive me. And you kind of oscillate back and forth. You're like, okay, well, I was initially here for this, and now I'm continuing to be in this. How does that relate to the initial? And then the conversation, the unfolding continues to unfold. And then you realize, wait, I'm participating now for a different reason that has to relate differently to why I initially started. And it's like this back and forth. And the problem with people arguing is that there's no awareness of that initial spot in relation to why they continue to participate. There is no back and forth. And when there is no back and forth, you get a real fuck you, not a friendly fuck you. Because the reason why I can say fuck you is because I know why we're all initially in this spot. Because we're trying to be more beautiful people at the end of the day. We're trying to, like, I hear Chetan, he talks about linguistics, I don't have a crazy linguistic background. He enlightens me almost every time he speaks. That's why I'm here. Like I'm just giving an example. The point is why I was saying, like, why can we disagree more? It's because we all know why we're here. Like, the theme is pretty clear. What will change is our orientation to the theme, the drive, our understanding of the drive's relation to the theme. One more thing. I think I said it. Basically, I said how the drive is retroactive, theme is proactive in that sense. But okay, I mean, I'll pass it off. Let me know what you guys think, or if there's nothing at all, that's cool too, but whatever.
No, that is beautiful. And yes, Clayton, I'm in agreement with that meal as well, with the tomato basil, because I freaking love tomato soup. I'll pass it to Phillip and Cheetah. I think you said a bunch that was really good right there. I think there is definitely a sense in which, like, the drive to continue with the relationship, even that there's a change in why you were there, but the change is thematic. It still aligns with the origin. And so the drive suggests a change that is still thematic because it is in alignment with the origin. It should be noted how interesting it is that almost human beings naturally seek to have an origin story that aligns with how they're living their life currently, or like when they are choosing what path they're going to live, they tend to look for a mythos or a kind of origin. Like, people are hungry for origin, almost as if they have a subconscious understanding of the need to make their present moment align with the initial starting position, if you will. Because, like, if a Christian, like if someone comes to be a Christian right now, they come to interpret their origin in light with, say, Genesis, right? Starting now. because they need to make the now align with an origin and like retrospectively acting a theme that then can make their current drive thematic in line with that origin, right? And so it's interesting how there's almost a subconscious sense of that. And what I hear you saying is the notion that when you do, you know, these kind of net conversations, these kind of conversations, has an awareness of that as well. That there is a certain origin that you have to keep alive. And if you lose that origin, then everything, drive becomes drive apart. Like things kind of drive apart. And I think what you see happen in most conversation is there's a driving apart that occurs, right? Like we're all here because we say care about America. That's why we're in this debate about the welfare, you know, the welfare system or something. And by the end of it, we've all driven apart because I'm convinced you're liberal and you hate America, and I'm convinced you're conservative and you hate America. So we don't share the same theme, say love of America or care about the American people, and now we've been driven apart. And that kind of suggests why it is so important that in these conversations, you never lose sight of that initial origin or that initial starting position. And there is an art to disagreement that doesn't threaten that origin, if you will. I think that's an awareness that everyone here has. There's a way to disagree. You cannot disagree in a manner that threatens the origin or that threatens, I love you, Clayton, you're a good soul. And so it's like that kind of idea, like, you know, when you're talking, you must not you must not lose the initial starting ground in the discussion, but at the same time, not fail to progress. Like you don't, like if you just stay, then that's no good, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be here talking. But there's an art to this. There's a way to do this. I think the other thing I'll say is like why there's like I agree, and then I'll give it to Phillip and then Chetan, I love you. And I agree with everything Andrew was saying on genius. Absolutely. And it's like what you see is I think people also come into these conversations, like no one's gonna come to the net and say something that's obviously stupid. Like really dumb. No one's going to do that. No one's going to come to a position that like alienates everyone else or creates a certain honest, like you would not be invited if you did that kind of thing, right? Because we all know that's the majority of conversation. When you try to talk about meaningful things with most people, they turn it into a you're stupid or I hate you or that's immoral. And so you gradually learn that you can't talk about philosophy or ideas with most people because they take that position. And so the hope of creating kind of like a net community, if you will, and to use that C word that everyone uses these days, but I used it there, is that there's a prerequisite of the kind of people who know how to talk in a manner that does not create that kind of demonization, right? So that right there is also going to change the quality of disagreement, right? Because most people, when they like that you try to have philosophical discussions with or politics or whatever, they deny sharing anything with you. Like they deny shareability. They deny the relation where they say, well, that's, you know, that's immoral or that's xenophobic or that's anti-patriot, you know, that's not patriotic, right? And so it's very important that you gradually learn that if you're going to have conversations that go into topics, that you have to be selective. Why are you selective, though? Is that because you're elitist? No, because you know the possibility of these kind of conversations require everyone to accept the same starting position and to try to maintain a fidelity to that origin in the drive. But that's a hefty prerequisite that most people don't meet. That is not a matter of elitism to look for, but the necessity, but is the necessary skills for the unfolding of the art of the thing that is the conversation. So you have to find people that can tell stories if you're going to let them in the story, you know, in the drawing room, right? Looper, please.
Sorry, let me just squeeze in real quick. I think, and again, disagree, but I think when people focus on the drive, when they're focusing on why they're continuing to be in the unfolding versus not focusing on what initially brought them to the unfolding, it actually causes the type of disagreement where you wouldn't be invited on the net.
Sure.
And I think that's honestly a problem that psychoanalysis has done, where it focuses on the continual like that, where it actually makes people not be cognizant of that initial starting position. And people, it's hard to think through that. It's like a lot of work because you're actively creating for yourself when you're thinking through that initial starting position. So it's like, yes, psychoanalysis, Lacan's correct, and like the split and all that stuff. I think there's a focus that actually causes more problems than solutions, if you will, because there's a lack of like storytelling in the sense of what is that initial positionality. And because I'll just say this and then I'll pass it off. Why is it the case that there's all these brilliant people, like in the 20th century, for example, all these really smart people, and yet it's also the same century that it has the most, like there's so much like prevalent violence. Not saying to get rid of violence, but I'm just saying we're in a world where there's more prevalent violence, more awareness of violence, and yet there's more awareness of the psyche as well. And more awareness of the split? Shouldn't there be less prevalent violence if that's the case? Well, I think the reason why that's not the case is because there's actually a lack of storytelling, a lack of actually relating back to initial positionality. And I think focusing on the drive in such a myopic sense actually makes you not allowed to, you know, relate back to that initial positionality. So I think we have to actively be proactive. We have to be active. We have to be proactive. We have to continually to create for ourselves and never hold and never be open to the unfolding and while you're continuing to participate in the unfolding. Sorry, but I just wanted, you just made me think of that. But yeah.
No, I think it's an excellent comment. And this would be a lovely example of emulating or showing the kind of quote unquote disagreement on the net that would be different from the "you're wrong, Andrew Luber." And then I'll pass it to Phillip and Chetan, because what I would say is I think what you just said about psychoanalysis is exactly right on the majority of interpretations that ways that people go about it. But at the same time, I've been reading this book by Lorenzo Chiesa, I can't say his last name, called The Not Two. And to me, he's exactly addressing that problem. Right? Like he's going in and saying, well, actually, we have to have a better understanding of the origin so that psychoanalysis is able to actually address the not two that is supposed to have this function. But here's the issue. I don't disagree that the majority of psychoanalysis has not done what that book is talking about. But at the same time, there's a form of psychoanalysis that does do what you're talking about. So what would it mean for me to disagree with you? Right? Like, what would the value be? Like, how do I disagree with you? You see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't seem like it's too blunt of an instrument. Like, I'm just going to say to you, like, I'm going to say yes, because what you're describing deals with a lot. It's like when people talk about what Hegel said and it's the popular understanding. It's like, it's not appropriate to say you're wrong and stupid to think that's what Hegel said, because actually they're responding to what most people have been taught in college and the majority of the zeitgeist. And even if it's a misinterpretation, it's a real fiction, just like Capital, right? So that's one of the things I think you also learn in these kind of conversations is that people are often speaking to a prevalent interpretation or a certain incompleteness that needs to be corrected. But it's more like it's more often like, it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's incomplete. So then you learn the art of addressing the fact that you're saying, well, that's incomplete, but it's not wrong. It just needs to be filled out. And there are some people that are trying to work to correct it. And so that's an example of where, to me, it may sound like I'm not disagreeing, but actually what I'm doing is refining or saying, yes, that's correct for the majority, but then there's actually people that are working on that. And I do see interpretations of Lacan that he's working on, I believe, seminars 18, 19, and 20 that are trying to show that Lacan had some awareness of that problem and kind of was speaking to it, right? But the majority of people who talk about Lacan are not going to be talking about those seminars in such a close way, right? So I feel like actually that's where a lot of colleges become irrelevant, because people just get PhDs proving that the popular reading is a misreading and that everyone is stupid. Okay, that's great, but like, what is the positive thing that we need to do? Like, how do we make decisions from there? And are you denying that this interpretation of psychoanalysis has not had a real impact on many people's lives and so on and so forth? And it'd be like, because it has, you can't just say that's stupid and feel like you finished the work, right? You have to do the work of replacing it with something, right? So that's where I think also in philosophy you learn, well, this kind of philosophy, if you want, I'll pass it to Phillip and Chetan. You just learn that overly direct disagreement is too blunt. It leaves way too much out, and it's not giving, and it's threatening the origin of the relationship too much, right? Like it's just not worth it. Like if I were to say to you, "That's stupid, Andrew," you'd be like, "Screw you, Dan," and you wouldn't be here next week, right? Like also, if I don't acknowledge that you're speaking to something real, then that's also not proper for the origin. But then if I acknowledge that's true, Andrew, without noting that Lorenzo in the book Not True is addressing it, then I'm also not showing fidelity to the quote unquote truth, if you will. And that double act of being a fidelity to the origin with fidelity to the truth is a skill of the language, if you will, that is not so obvious of what that looks like. And I feel like that is what you see a lot of people in these kind of conversations actually doing, rather because they subconsciously know it or they've trained it or whatever. They have this sense of the need to do the double act of fidelity to the truth and fidelity to the relationship. And that requires a certain way of talking that maintains them both. To use Michelle's example of holding the bird in the open hand or the pen, you got to do this. If you do this, it's a problem. If you do this, it's a problem. You got to do this and figure out how to talk in a manner to do that. But let me pass it to Phillip and Chetan. Phillip, please.
And being able to talk like that requires a certain alacrity of tongue. And a lot of people don't even have the ability to breathe well enough so that they can train that muscle. There are so many times when not scratching the itch has to do with either holding the tongue or taking the direction in which it moves and really considering, what are we talking about? I'm not sure with the elitism thing. I actually think on some level this might be given the sort of educational zeitgeist a mark of like an elite or a more elite type that I think most times what will happen is someone will point to you having an advantageous position within the capitalist discourse. You have some kind of relation to S1 that allows you to, explore X, Y, and Z, and like, it's tricky because there are like, to use like a phrase of or an image from Reich, there are like creative universal thoughts, and then there is the little man parallel. So you come out with like a great awesome thought, and then there's like the parallel. So like love your neighbor. Everyone's like, okay, clearly no one loves their neighbor. Everyone is just trying to pat someone's back so that they can get something. That's the world we're in. And it's like, no, love people unconditionally. And they're like, I've never seen that. I get that someone said that in a book. Like, I have no idea how to measure that. And like, when we talk about this space of not having a yardstick, one of the things I found is like a friend is almost always considered a potential drinking buddy. I find that when you have a substance that you're both consuming and you go off into like these territories, you can always just be like, dude, it was the peace pipe, or like, my bad, dude, I had one too many, and it's like, yeah, okay, that's fine. But sometimes I feel like this is kind of interesting. Like the Catholics get together, they say some words, they rub the palm ash on the third eye, and then it's like they can they can like somehow speak more freely, or there's like some defenses that are brought down. One of the interesting things I thought, Jock, and you were saying about the indifference and the disagreement on ice cream. I think that too has some levels. I don't think people mind so much if there's a disagreement of taste, of sound, of smell. For some reason, when it comes to the eyes, it's a big deal. Someone's like, hey, here's what I saw. And someone's like, you saw that? What? You're like, yeah, we were looking at the same picture. You didn't see this? And somehow this, I don't know, maybe we're a hypervisual time. I mean, we probably are, but like, it could also be that there's something with our identity that's wrapped up with like, I saw what happened. And then how do you kind of like expand that out with like deep fakes, etc. I wonder if this also mutually assured indifference is sometimes like actually bumps up with human life as such. That is sort of like, yeah, I'm really indifferent. Because we lack, like what Luber was saying, like these sort of meta narratives, this story that can like bind us and allow us to delay certain types of gratification. Um, and I wonder how much too, like having just like a tete-a-tete, if you can make a distinction between speaking to a subject and speaking to the subject, that asks a little bit of the other person, like a little bit of grace, like a little bit of like, hey, I'm doing my best to like speak to the subject. I know there's an excess in everything I say. Um, he's like what you said about forgiveness. That's really good. Like, please allow, a creative detour or two. Um, and I wonder sometimes if increased boredom leads to more wheel spinning in disagreements. Because it feels like, oh, well, what difference will this disagreement make? Versus like, no, we're actually like building something where we're able to advance conversation. We move out of the idle chatter into the deep talk so that each time we return, it's not like we're going all the way back. We're continuing our, architectural conversation. Yeah, and then the high speed wit. I wonder like how you treat people with dial-up wit. And like I think so much about like when you're a kiddo, right? Because I got two little nephews, and I'm just like, how are they going to be able to talk? It actually blows my mind. I'm like, you barely hold your head up, barely. Anytime you feel some kind of, or at least I read into you feeling something in your body that's not right, you just make a ton of noise. And it's like, how in T-5 years, all that's going to change. And then 10 years after that, it's going to be completely different. What might an educational landscape look like to compensate for this terrifying fact that we may all be born equally, but we certainly grow differently? And like, how can you help people if, because it seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If it's like we want to have people that have high wit, okay, fine. I'm about it. Like I'm about people that are, kind of got you know, the gears going. But to get into the group, like what if they keep getting, stuck and they're like, I'm doing my best. I don't I think disagreement too is like an exploration, as just like a feeler of what's going on where someone else is. Just kind of like sometimes throwing things out there purposefully, I think can be not in like a troll-like way, but just in a way of like, I don't yet know this person. Um, to see whether or not they've done the work or have read some tweets. And then I think sometimes like maybe the thing overcoating all of us is our level of disagreement with the labor conditions. This seems to be like an interesting thing because I'm like, part of what I do to continue my food and housing habit is fill out forms. I help people fill out forms. And I come to this like Kafka dead end where I'm like, okay, if I do a real bad job with this, I might lose my job. But if I do a good job with this, I'll have more forms to fill out. So like like I don't mind going to farmland, it's chill, but like sometimes I wonder about those people, like in a disagreement, it's like, oh, we want to move on. But there's like these people that are like, like gluing their hands to the concrete, and like stopping traffic and the laying flat movement in China and all this stuff. That's like, when is it appropriate to kind of put your whole being on the line in order to maybe have a better day in, day out existence for yourself and maybe future generations.
Outstanding. I'll give it to Chetan. And I'm glad that we're all drinking buddies. drinking of philosophy, you get drunk. Yeah, man, I don't know why I said it's just a neck conversation. You know how that goes, man. You know what? So it's all drink. There is something about beauty that creates drunkenness, though, right? Like good and true, there's a kind of drunkenness that comes in that sort of spirit. I'm also thinking, I want you to know that my body makes noises too when I don't have coffee and I want coffee. All I do is just make noises. So I'm like that. I think also when I say elite, no, I think you're exactly right. It's the issue is it almost like there's a kind of elitism that is I am better than other people. Pride elitism, and then there's an elitism that is skill-based. Like you develop a certain skill. Now, there's an argument to be like, what are the conditions? Like if you even have the ability to develop that skill, surely you had access to leisure that other people didn't have, et cetera, so forth. You could make those arguments. Then the argument is, okay, well, are we saying no one should have the time to do that? Or are we saying that we need to change the labor conditions so that more people have time for that, right? And then you would say, but what if some people don't want to do that, right? So then you have to get into all of those socioeconomic, political economics. And that's why I've been talking with Bowens on the Commons and all of those different things. I think basically human beings find themselves trapped between mutually assured indifference and mutually assured destruction. And one of the reasons they go toward destruction is because it feels more intimate than indifference. So then they're like, well, all we know how to do is fight, but that means we care. So let's fight to make sure we care, because it's better to be in a relationship with someone I fight with than someone I'm indifferent with. But of course, we might go, you could try care, but you see, care requires skills that people don't have and they don't know where to get, right? So they're stuck between these two options, oscillating back and forth and stuff like that. And so I think there is a disagreement. Like I would disagree with the education system, what is taught and what is associated as being educated, right? Because I also think that when we talk about wit, I was talking with Yuri on the notion of a kind of nimbleness, the ability, it's not like being intelligent per se, because I know a lot of people who are like just blue collar entrepreneurs that are very nimble and they're kind of anti-fragile in their ability to move between systems. And there's a certain nimbleness, but you see education does not in its structure as a medium teach you that having this kind of nimbleness is actually what it means to be educated. What's educated is, say, memorization, doing well on tests. So I think there are ways, yes, there's always going to be different people with different abilities of that. But if you change the education system to not create a subconscious association where getting good at that is to waste your time, to in fact remove the trivia structure as we talked about in the Ivan Illich course, so that people associate that capacity with a good use of the education, well, then we start to see the spreading of the conditions of the capacity to not be stuck in a pendulum between indifference and destruction, to actually have the ability to work through relationships in a more, like we're doing in this conversation. But I'm glad we can all be drinking buddies. Let me pass it to Chetan here.
I just sort of maybe wanted to sort of talk more about this question of measurement that we are sort of all discussing. And I think central to this discussion of agreement and disagreement, which I wanted to explore. If you think about this, when I'm saying that there's no common measure, one side, I think as Daniel pointed out, is the question of arbitrariness. But there's the other side also, that even when we bring some universal general form of measurement tactics, and I know universal general are not same, I'm just using them for laziness, but even when there are general and universal forms of measurement possible, the result is still the same. That, in that sense that both these things do not hold what, say, any philosophical discourse would want to hold within itself in some senses, ideally speaking, or any education discourse in that sense. That question is not that can we have a better standard of measurement or not. The question actually is, are there forms of measurement that escape any generalized standards and yet don't become arbitrary? That's the nuanced problem. And that is a form of measurement that emerges in any kind of education or learning as well. So if I say I have played basketball for 10 years, if another person has played in front of me, we would have a language, a way of measuring things which would escape any standardized forms of measurement. That is what it means to be part of what Wittgenstein calls, inhabiting a language or a language game in that sense. A language game emerges like this, like you play chess. There are rules that can be written in any book, but then there are forms of play which would only be who's played chess for years would know it. This is what Deleuze called intensive dimension, or intensity in that sense, or Hegel's negativity sort of has the same kind of connotation. I may connect it back to Andrew's question of drive in that sense. So in Zupančič, if I remember, there's a very pertinent line on superego in Zupančič's text, What is Sex?, where she says that drive, in some senses, moves with this question of enjoyment, of course. But drive's aim is not enjoyment. Drive's aim is to, in some senses, capture the negativity, hold the negativity, if you think about it. Agreement and disagreement are forms and ways through which we traverse through this intensive dimension, this negativity. We hold it in that sense. When it stops serving this purpose, then it becomes meaningless. Both agreement and disagreement can become meaningless. And to the point, it's serving this purpose of holding the negativity, traversing us this negative dimension, which opens up this third dimension in some senses, which is different from both quality and quantity, extensive and intensive magnitudes, and so on and so forth. It is really meaningful. You can have many Sufi jokes on this. There are two Sufi thinkers or two monks who meet every day, and they come and they violently disagree with each other, fight almost, and then go home. And one day somebody would come and ask them, why are you doing this? You don't understand. We are actually talking. So you can find these kinds of metaphors emerging because we understand that this third dimension can actually open up to us in dialogue at times and at moments when we least realize it. When we least expect it to happen. Philosophy has a task to domesticate it to some degree. It wants to domesticate this dimension. It wants to have a claim over this dimension, and we can have a fair questions about to what degree it can do that. What is its limitations and scope. But I'll just say the last thing, that politics as a space is only possible because this dimension can open. Politics would not be possible if there would be some standardized measure for things. And we all could measure from that standard. There's no politics possible. As Lacan would say, there's no other of the other in that sense. Politics is only possible because human beings from time to time have to open themselves to this dimension. And they have to, in some senses, put themselves in certain kinds of dialogue and opinions which cannot be measured from the outside, from any standardized setting, and neither can it be completely arbitrary. We have to find ways of living together which will emerge from, ways of agreement and disagreement that we have to create for ourselves. And that task of living in the human domain and language domain that I think we all are,
That's outstanding. I really like. I think that point you're making on disagreement. Almost, I want to say disagreement with the dish in parentheses because they always have to go together. Disagreement. It always needs to be, in a sense, contained in a kind of authoritative particularity. And as disagreement with the parentheses moves away from that, it becomes more and more meaningless. It makes me think of like with piano. And then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. It's like, yeah, you can tell what's better and what's worse. I disagree. That's good music. And we know it because we've done this. And so there's a meaningful here. But if we start talking about good piano for everyone, everywhere, it starts losing its meaning in a way, or like the relevance of it. And I really like what you were saying on democracy. Like, to me, what that is getting at is when James Hunter talks about substantive democracy, which we've never really done. Because we've used democracy as looking for a kind of universal measure, as opposed to a conversation between these various particular authority disagreements that are going between. And as a result, it's been mostly totalitarian or power in very problematic ways. So I really like that point. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Chetan's saying, it's funny. I'm hearing this discussion about measure. It kind of reminds me of discernment, and in particular, the idea of an exemplar as a measure. So a lot of times, and within disciplines and studies, asking the question, what would X do, right? What would Mozart do? What would Jesus do? What would X, that's a very different operation than, I always say, what would Aristotle do? in particular context. That's very different than asking what's the average word count in a book, in one of the books of Aristotle, for example. That's a completely different device of understanding. You're going to probably get a lot more generative understanding from the hypothetical question of an exemplar. What would X do under the situation versus some average quantified measurement? That's what I thought of when I was hearing what Chetan was saying about that. And that's also and kind of building what Daniel said too, right? Is that, for a lot of these kind of more subtle arts, it requires a kind of attuned soul to even be able to perceive, to make a judgment in the first place. Basically, I use the example of our souls being thermometers. If our thermometer isn't working, you can't pick up the nuance. You can't pick up the measurement of the temperature. You're not fit to make a measure in the first place. I don't think we like that. And in terms of a democratic political opinion, that we don't like acknowledging that point. But yet we do, because we have this technocratic opinion, like, oh no, it's too complicated. So we have this weird dichotomy where we feel like everything should be decided by everybody in a political setting. And almost like this air of, but yet at the same time, we say things are too complicated. We can't make decisions. So we need technocratics who know better. And by the way, it's like that's not even a question of general mass voting kind of majority rule attitude. That applies just as much with, for example, like basically Republican representative governments like the Senate or the House. There's a long history of a lot of them just deferring their judgments. Like, yeah, we're the one who has to make the vote, but we're going to defer to the judge, to this either executive branch or some kind of expert advisement. I mean, basically, there's stories of political lobbies writing the laws. They just give it to the lawmaker to then just pass through. This seems like a wild violation of expectation of what we think should happen politically. So I'm kind of just chewing on that last part. It's like we both have a very big concern of elitism, of a kind of aristocratic kind of either oligarchy or some other mode like that. And we dress it up in a performance, kabuki theater of the democratic. Yet in reality, it really does play out that way. But a more general point from just political is this question of measurement by discernment of an exemplar that is probably maybe a better instrument for a lot of discussions. I know for a lot of nuanced points, it tends to be the case. I think just that kind of question, the what would X do? When you're an informed, you have to be an informed person. That only works if you're informed yourself. You got to have enough in the system to actually get that mechanism to go, to be useful. It's not very useful otherwise. That's why we usually, if people don't have the equipment to handle that kind of hypothetical what would X do mode, that we just give them quantified averages or just numbers to quantify. Give me this word. By the way, I teach. I know this game. When I sense students don't have it in them, oh yeah, give me 10 directions. Use 2 colors, like everything gets dropped to a quantity because there's nothing else to be done. I get to work with that. But my more new mature students who I know can handle it, I'll do hypotheticals. And if I'm looking at a piece, it depends on the context. But like, for example, if they're working, I get sent in a certain artist direction, I'll say, what would Cezanne do in this painting? This requires them to know who Cezanne is and know the implications of what I'm implying with that kind of question. And then they have to do the work. And then you kind of leave it to them to work it through to see how that plays out. So I'm fully admitting this requires a completely different level of I guess maturity is the right way to put it. No, that's not kind of intellectual maturity. You got to use which instruments required at the time. And that's what I got. I yield.
Outstanding. I'll pass it to Phillip here, and just there really was, famously, everyone knows the story where Benjamin Franklin was asked, what kind of government did you make? And he said, oh, a democracy, a republic, but a democratic republic, if you can keep it. They understood that democracy was elite. It was an elite thing to engage in democracy. And what we've turned it into is democracy is something everyone participates in. But they, I think, more classically had a deep understanding that that was only possible with a certain kind of elite capacity. There seems to be a difference between elites in democracy, which is usually what we think we're talking about when we talk about elites who then control everything and it's a problem, and then democracy as elite, as some sort of skill, as some sort of capacity that has to be taught, and we have not taught it. I think basically it has a lot to do with discernment, and I'll talk in a moment between, there's a difference. I've been reading Karatani, and he talks about the difference between democracy in Athens and democracy in Iona, what he talks about, and there's just kind of a different conception that is going on. But let me give it to Phillip here. Phillip Shinn.
That just prompted an image. I don't know if it's Kabuki, Gyogen, or the No style of theater where they have the stagehands in black on stage. It just made me think we're experiencing a political theater wherein the lobbyists are just like, nope, nobody act like we're here. Like, and it expands to like medical theater as well. Like all these things that we're sort of like, do we have much say over what goes on in our life? And granted, there's a difference between having 0.001% and 0.1% control. And this is often the mark of maturity, is seeing that and seizing it. But yeah, sometimes it does feel like a play.
But the Super Bowl commercials told me I had agency, Phillip, so it's fine, okay? Oh, I saw the commercials. They said I have control. Let me give it to Chetan. So it's fine, okay?
Shop like a billionaire.
Yeah, man.
Shop.
We're going to be good to go in different, but let me give it to Chetan here. Chetan, please.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say this, on the discussion of teacher-students. It's a discussion I have every year with students, and that when I sort of get them to a class first time and tell them that the way I'll mark you and judge you in the class, there's no objective criteria in that sense through which everybody can be marked on the same grounds. Isn't possible. Any philosophy course starts with that assumption in that sense. Yet the fact that I can judge you is not a completely subjective affair. There is still objectivity in my judgment, even when there is no singular common standard from which all judgments can be made. And this is something most students get confounded by. How can something which is varying from situation to situation still have some consistency within it, still have an objective dimension to it? And that's the challenge to think of this problem. Problem discernment. And I think Joaquin's point about example as being a question of, Agamben has a very nice discussion on example in one of his books. I don't remember. But example as something that emerges from the context is a very interesting thing. Why are examples making sense to us? The examples are not something which have universal criteria. Yet we explain things through examples. What is example doing in a writing, for instance? It's an extremely interesting question which we do not give enough attention to, I think.
No, I think that is brilliant. I mean, as you all know, I'll talk about conditionalism, where certain conditions, there's a difference between a kind of conditional judgment and a kind of relative or subjective judgment. Like if I know the conditions of who you are and what you do, I can judge objectively on those things that are conditional, but that does not mean it is just kind of relative in an empty sense. But that conditional judgment, if you grant me that language, because I talk about conditionalism, that requires skill, that requires time, that requires discernment, that requires an entire orchestra of capacities that if you do not have, then yeah, it seems like it's all relative, because you don't have the experience to know there's a difference between conditional and relative. So it becomes a kind of enclosure where you can't tell the difference. Like I think about, there was a Warner, he wrote this kind of ideas in theology on God's judgment, where there's this guy who's like a saint he's describing. He said, and he was a terrible person. He's like, why is this guy a saint? Because one time when he was 55 years old, he didn't kick a kitten. And God knew that that was the absolute best that this person could do, that by not kicking that kitten, it was the same in its sort of holiness as some like missionaries that had saved 200,000 people or something like that, right? The point of the example is he was describing God's judgment in this kind of Christian theological conception as radically conditional, that is able to see that for this person, not kicking a kitten at 55 years old required a certain holiness equivalent that for other people was like, feeding 100 homeless shelters or something like that, right? Quantitatively, very different. But regard to what that individual was, because he was born with a mental handicap, et cetera, and couldn't control his body, or then it was different. So there's a conditional judgment. Democracy only works if people have the capacity of conditional judgment, which is fundamentally somewhat elite and difficult to teach. And if you do not have it, then you cannot judge you do not have it, and therefore it vanishes, and therefore the possibility of a democracy that actually functions as elite versus consists of elites who run it in a way, you lose it. And what was very interesting is when Koratani was talking about, like, you know, classically, as everyone knows, you know, Plato and them were like, democracy, really? Mob rule, that's what you want, okay. And what Katani's like, well, when you look at democracy in Eunoia, which is not based on a state or a nation, it's basically, to be very general, it's very Tocquevillian, and it's very much like this. We are discussing issues to work on our conditional judgment by which to operate more anarchy. Eunoia was very anarchist, not entirely, they were still governing, but there was more anarchist, but it required to have that little of a state, it required a lot of conditional judgment. But very critically, what Koratani notes is that the fail-safe for Eunoia democracy was the ability to be nomads. People could leave if power took over. They could go to a different country. Well, we know that. What did the Pilgrims do? What did people do in Europe? The Huguenots, you know, they left when there was tyranny, right? What do we do today when basically going somewhere that's not under some sort of power of the state is no longer an option, and democracy is no longer based on conditional judgment, but basically either a mob rule or it's been usurped by the power structure, capital, you know, Koratani talks about the capital nation state. It doesn't matter which of those three run the show. If one of them run the show, then the capital nation state runs the show, right? So this is a problem that, you know, basically it's kind of like, this has not been thought because it never had to be thought. Well, now it does. How do you have something like a Eunoia democracy that is basically a spreading of conditional judgment, if we grant that phrase, that doesn't have the option of leaving if it fails, you know, going somewhere else? I guess we'll go to Mars or something. But that doesn't sound great. I saw that Brad Pitt movie. Wasn't working for me, man. I'm not going to be the Martian trying to grow some grass or whatever. But this is getting at, I think, the issue, and that's why I get interested in Tocqueville and different things. But I do think conditional judgment, the ability to identify particular objectivity that is authoritative but not generalizable and able to speak from that place to other standing points, other origins, other thematic drives is an incredible skill that's very difficult. And we need to, well, if we can at least identify it's important, then we might be able to spread it or at least begin thinking the possibility of teaching it. But I have to run. This has been a treat, Mr. Jock, and it's a delight. Chetan, Phillip, Andrew, your puppy's adorable. Thank you all. I appreciate that we could all come together and disagree in parentheses with the dish about disagreement with the parentheses around the dish. It's been a treat. So thank you all. You're beautiful. I love you.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good morning. Good night. Good afternoon, everyone. All the best. All the best.